Okay, it is high noon. That means it's time for the Architects and Heroes live stream show. This is Stephen R. of Zygo here with you, and we have an amazing, amazing guest here today. But first and foremost, I want to shout out Analog Cases. We have our very first sponsor in Analog Cases. Analog Cases is an amazing company. They make amazing cases for electronic music machine. They really help focus the attention on helping producers protect your gear. The cases are lightweight and durable. I'm going to get much better at this, I promise. Lightweight and durable. Right now, some of their best-selling cases and really amazing ones are the Universal Audio Apollo Twin, Teenage Engineering OP1. They've got an amazing case for the SP404, the Roland machine. Also, they've just got some new audio interface cases in for the Glide case for the Universal Audio Aero and the Universal Audio Aero 4, which is fantastic. Also, and I just have to say this, that they have the most amazing YouTube channel where they have their producers go out and they go out to like places in the woods and they make beats. So want to thank Greg for believing in us and being our first sponsor. And I swear I will get better at the whole promotion thing. But today we have the amazing Brandon Stosuy. How are you, sir?
Good. How are you doing?
Was that the correct pronunciation? Because we spent time off camera.
Perfect. That was pitch perfect. Yeah,
awesome.
That's great.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for doing this. I know you've got a lot on your plate right now, and there's just so much that you have involved yourself with over the years. And I wouldn't just read verbatim the bio that first of all, and I mentioned this off camera. You're a hard man to find a bio for. That's like, if you stay pretty under the radar. And I love the fact that each company that's published you before or anyone you've been involved with, in terms of writing, have their own clip. But I'm going to read what I put together. So maybe so Brandon. You're the editor-in-chief and co-founder of the Creative Independent and Kickstarter, the co-founder of the Basilica Soundscape Festival in Hudson, New York, the co-founder of Zone 6 Artist Management and Gallery. You've been the music curator for the Broad Museum in LA, here in my hometown, and at the MoMA PS1 in New York. You were previously the Director of Editorial Operations at Pitchfork. You have done a book with Matthew Barney. You've written kids' books, and you've got a trilogy of books that are on Abrams. This one is out now, called Make Time for Creativity. That has been out since September. You are, by any stretch of the imagination, a very, very busy person.
Well, thank you, first of all. That was a great introduction. And I think that was part of the idea of making time for creative work. It's one of those things where, we were talking before we went on, like I grew up in a very small town, in a farming town, and I always just had a job from very early on, when I was 13 and was like, all right, I want to get a stereo. My parents were like, well, okay, go get a job and then you can get a stereo. And so I worked in a blueberry field picking blueberries. And in that job, you weren't paid by the hour, you were paid by how much you picked. So you really couldn't slack off. If you were just standing there and screwing around or joking around, you would make no money. So I just kind of learned very early on just to kind of, when I'm there, actually to put in the work and to sort of make the work happen. And it's just always been like that. So I've never been in the position where I could just like do one thing. And I think I'm happy for that. It's sort of influenced the way that I work creatively now. Like I think, I have 2 children, so I get up early to do the writing when they're not awake. So I know I can just kind of focus on that. When the day starts and I'm doing emails and talking to artists I manage or running the site, those things can be a little more interrupted. And I found that as I was developing like a process for myself, that most people don't just live off of their creative work, and I think that's what that book was targeted at, like people who have to kind of find the time to make their creative work and to really make an effort to kind of keep doing that stuff, because it can so easily fall by the side, where you're like, all right, I'm burnt out after my day job. I can't do this. And I found that happening where I would try to write at night and I would just fall asleep, or just like not have any ideas. So that's where I was like, oh, I'll just start getting up early. And that's like a very simple thing, but somehow that changed everything for me. And suddenly I was getting the stuff done I wanted to get done. And it's one of those things too, where if you do it every day, you don't have a huge weight on your shoulders, you know, because suppose I get up one morning and the washing machine has exploded, all these things have gone wrong, and I'm like, oh no, I've like lost the time I thought I'd have. It's not the end of the world because I know I'm going to get up the next day again. So it just, again, it's like goes back to like the old blueberry picking where it's just like, just keep going, you know, and then each thing doesn't need to be this super momentous exercise. Like my friend John, who's a trainer, like a physical trainer, and also like designs body armor for the military, but is also a photographer, does a lot of things. And he was, you know, it says explained to me like, yeah, he rides his bike everywhere to stay in shape, but he also brings his camera with him. And if he sees stuff, he can take photos. When he trains people, and he also trains alongside them, then he's getting in his workout, like all these little things that he does. And one thing he's always put that I really enjoy is he said this idea that once you have momentum, it's easier to maintain momentum. So like in a very physical way, like if you're doing a bench press and you get stuck at the bottom, it's hard to kind of keep going. Where if you just kind of keep it loose and keep moving, it's easier to make the next motion. So I kind of think about that with like creative work, you know, like if you keep going, it's easier to keep going. If you like build it up in your head and only try to like exercise once a month, it's hard to keep doing it. And if you only find time to make creative work like once every couple months, you put too much pressure on yourself. At least I found that I would, and I'd feel like frustrated. Oh, I didn't get the part I wanted to get done. And then it's harder to kind of start it up again. So that was the book was supposed to be about.
Well, I mean, it's, you know, I'm about halfway through the book right now myself. And, you know, it's really funny because it starts with kind of reframing what it is that you consider to be the, what is your schedule really like, right? So
yeah.
We're talking about, you know, the ability to find, you know, maybe 5 minutes here or 10 minutes there or 15 minutes there where you can actually do that and to actually like go through this because for those who are not familiar with the book, and again, it's I cannot recommend this more highly because I'm half the way through it at the moment. You know, is that it really kind of makes you question your routines in a lot of very practical ways. It really, you know, and I'm curious, but before I get too into the meat of the book, I'm curious, you know, how do you go from blueberry picking? I mean, I know that you have this kind of this really great story and this trajectory of getting you into the place where you are now with multiple different endeavors. But how did you first kind of get exposed to this? There's a little bit about this in the book. But I would like to hear your story about kind of how you got to this point where you're doing all of these things and being very successful at managing. Because to me, when I start a project, one of the most challenging things is to carve out enough time and planning to actually just get it done. You know, and you seem to be doing, you know, quite a lot of that.
I think early on, I mean, this is something that comes up in the second book that I finished and is going to come out in May, which is about like my hometown and realizing how much that had influenced me. You know, at the end of the day, like when I was growing up in it, I felt like this place is really small. I hate it. Like all those kinds of things you would think about a small Pine Barren town of 800 people. But I had a thing where my dad was from Brooklyn and my mom was from Brooklyn. And my grandparents were from Russia, but lived in Brooklyn. And so like we would go to the city to visit them. So I had these kind of like small town world and city world. So I had enough exposure to like hardcore and things like that I knew about punk, but I couldn't really get it where I was. And so what I started doing was just kind of making my own stuff because I lived in a town without any of it. So I made a zine, and like making a zine was really my first thing that sort of showed me I could make something and complete something and then send it out somewhere and have people actually respond to it. And at the time, like I didn't even know how to pronounce it. I thought it was called a zine because I like didn't even know, you know, I'd never heard anyone say the word zine before. And I just went into some record store in New York. And like when you're like a nervous, you know, 12-year-old or 13-year-old, you're not going to talk to anyone working there because you don't want them to make fun of you. So I would just go in and buy stuff and leave. And then it would be up to me to kind of figure it out on my own back in Chatsworth, New Jersey, where I'm like, okay, you know, and that's how I discovered a lot of stuff. Like you'd buy like a Sonic Youth record, read the liner notes. Well, they mentioned Raymond Carver. Who's that? And I would like go to the library, which was 40 minutes away, look up Raymond Carver. Oh, he's a short story writer. So like this very slow process. But really it was just this impulse of because there wasn't anything there, I wanted to try to make my own stuff. And I put on hardcore shows. Like the beauty of growing up in like a farming town is there's a lot of space. So I'd put on like hardcore shows in the backyard. And then it kind of culminated when I was like 17, about to turn 18. I convinced my dad to let me put on like a 2-day festival in his backyard and, in like the field behind the house. And we didn't have like a stage. So I got like a hay truck and stabilized it. My friend Ed Chang, who's like a jazz musician who is like from New York and like collaborated with like what's his name? John Zorn and all these people. Like he came and did sound. It's just like it was like borrowed a PA from someone else. It was like so piecemeal.
Yeah.
And we put this thing together. And this guy Bill, I know, who I'm still friends with, who lives in LA now. He was living in Philadelphia at the time. He was like, "Hey, I saw flyers for your show. Can I put them up?" So it became this like whole, really like sort of duct taped together endeavor. But like hundreds of people came, and we charged like $7 for the whole weekend, like super cheap. But I ended up making enough money to sort of put out a proper CD. And that was like this first move from like zine to show to CD. Then we started doing 7-inches, like my friend Mark and I, and like noise cassettes. And just kind of, I think early on, because there wasn't anything there, if you wanted something, you had to make it. And the zine was the first step. And like actually seeing people order it, like it would get like a little review in like Fact Sheet 5 or Max Rock and Roll. And suddenly I was like, all right, this is amazing. Or that once got my zine was called White Bread. It was kind of like growing up in a white trash town and like being working class and that kind of thing. And I worked at a Cumberland Farms and I'd always be stocking the bread. So I just kind of thought about, here I am, this kid who doesn't quite make sense in this place, like that kind of, like the alienated teenager kind of vibe. And that was when I would send it out to other alienated teenagers and they would write back. I was like, wow, there's actually like a community out there. And that really spurred me on to keep making stuff. So that was the beginning. Then I think it just kind of kept moving. And, by the time I went to college, I met other people doing zines. We all had a house together. We put shows in the basement. It's just kind of one of those sorts of things where it was very much like part of DIY culture and punk culture is if something's not there, you just make it or you try to make it. And it doesn't have to be perfect. You just want to give it a shot. And like, that first show I did at my dad's, the 2-day thing, I made so many mistakes. Like I booked too many bands. Like the sound was terrible. Like I didn't order enough porta potties, like just like things like that, like logistics. But I sort of did it and I realized, wow, if I could do this with like no budget, just kind of like calling on friends to help, that felt to me like a very like huge first step to then moving on to something bigger. Yeah.
I mean, I it's a long way from, doing this on a farm somewhere to, collaborating with Matthew Barney and to being in charge of the editorial staff at Pitchfork. So there's a lot of interim steps, I'm sure, but it sounds like with where with your background and where you came from and kind of that ethos, that DIY ethos, a lot of that is really baked into the book, honestly. I grew up in Oklahoma, so I completely empathize with like there really not being a whole lot. I mean, there were pockets of things for sure, but a lot of that you had to kind of do a lot of ferreting out, even if you wanted it to be a fan and just engage with it on some level. Right. You had to find out where to go. And this was kind of pre-internet days too. So there's no, you don't just pick up your phone and find out where a thing is. It's different. It's a different thing, I
think too, like when you're saying like the collaborations with Matthew, I feel like so much of that stuff always just came naturally. I've never been like a networker per se, where I'd go out and try to like make connections. I would just kind of follow things as they naturally happened. And it's funny because when I eventually moved to Canada for a while when I was younger, when you could just move to Canada, before 9/11, and you could just kind of like load your van up and be like, I'm going to Canada. And I was living in Portland, Oregon. I, met some girl from my zine. I was like 20 or something. I was like, cool, I'm going to go move to Canada and like live with this person. And at the time you could do that. And I did it. And while I was there, I worked in a gas station and like a gardening center. And finally, like I applied for some like permanent residence and got it. And I could get like other jobs. And I kept working. And finally I got a job at an art gallery. And when I worked at the art gallery, my job was to like one of my jobs was to maintain the gallery's library. And I was like, that was around the time that Matthew was really taking off. So I'd be like filing these magazines. I was like, man, this art is crazy. Like who is this guy? This seems like so different than anything I've ever seen. So I'd always read about it and reading about him. So I knew about his work. And one of my friends, Drew Daniel, who's in the band Matmos. Yeah, who I'd known through like my Pitchfork stuff. I was like, yeah, I really like Matthew's work. This is like really interesting artist. And he's like, oh, I know Matthew because Drew had done stuff with Bjork and there was like a connection there. And I was like, oh, cool. Yeah, I'd love to talk to him at some point. And I didn't really, that's all I said. And then one day I woke up and there was an email just from Matthew saying like, the subject was like from Matthew Barney. And then he was just like, hey, Drew mentioned we might like be able to bond on metal and stuff. We should talk, whatever. And we just like hit it off and started hanging out immediately, like went to go see Sun together. And then like a few months later, like this is very much of the season. Like he invited me and Jane, who was my girlfriend at the time, over for Thanksgiving dinner. And we just like, we've been friends now for, 15 years, to the point that like, when I first met him, his daughter was, 2, and now she's a teenager. And it's like one of those things where we've just been friends forever. And it all just happened out of like a shared interest. And then we started doing shows together out at his studio, because it was like a way for us to collaborate in like a sort of like mellow way, where it wasn't like the pressure of his world or the pressure of my world. And we started making these small little events that we just invite friends to. And now we've been doing that for 12 years at a space we call Remains. And it reminds me actually like of the shows I used to do when I was a teenager, where we would like do like, we'd have like a black metal band come and like play in the round with everybody around them, where we were like grilling pigs in the back. Like we just sort of did all these, like we just sort of, let's just have this event space. We can just do this thing, a way for us to share and be friends. But then like we looked back and we're like, whoa, we've been doing this for 12 years now. Mm-hmm. So much that we've done. So now he and I are actually working on a book about that space and that project. But again, it was like not something that we set out to do, and we weren't like, yeah, let's like write a book about this. It was just like fun for us. And then once we had hindsight and we had friends photograph everyone and videotape them and stuff, so like, wow, we have a lot of material here. Let's like do something on it. So I think that's like just an example of how you were saying there's like all the steps between. But yeah, for me, it was always like not very carefully charted out. Like when I was at Pitchfork, I remember like interns would ask like, hey, how do you become like director of editorial operations? I was like, man, well, first you like work the graveyard shift at a gas station. And it's just sort of like, there's really no way to sort of explain it, because it all was just one thing to the next thing. And then so much of it is luck too. Just like if I think about that, like if Drew hadn't have decided, I'm going to email him, I wouldn't have had this person who's like, become one of my best friends, and we've done so much together. And just all these little things that happen because of one person that you become friends with. And yeah, like I think there's so many ways things could have just like turned slightly differently, and you'd be over there or over here. And it's very hard to take track of that stuff. And there's no like clear path basically.
There's no like clear formula. What I find really interesting about the way that your career has evolved over the years is that you absolutely have one foot in the art world completely, right? I mean, the work that you do with with the galleries and all of the sort of elements that come into it. Obviously, there's the music piece, but the through line and the connective tissue is your writing. It's the writing and it's sort of pulling together those types of things. And also, you mentioned that you guys bonded over metal. You've been doing the Show No Mercy column on Pitchfork since 2006. Is that
Yeah, I started it then. I don't do it anymore, but I started in 2006. But when I left Pitchfork to start the Creative Independent, mm-hmm. I stopped doing the column then, and I left on very good terms with Pitchfork, and we're all still friends and everything. But I basically was like, if I'm going to go start another website, it's going to be really hard to try to do this column too. So, but this guy Sam Sodomsky, who's like a very knowledgeable metalhead, he kind of took over in my wake, but he chose like a different name and stuff, so it wouldn't be like he was.
Yeah, it's hard to it's a different take on it, I'm sure. But so tell me about sort of the inspiration to get the Creative Independent going after you left Pitchfork.
Sure, yeah, I think it's sort of like what you were saying, like having one foot in a different world, in the art world. And, when I went to school, I went for like English, for literature, and like I had different interests. And so by the time I left Pitchfork, I'd been there for so long, I was kind of just burnt out on only writing about music. And so part of the idea with the Creative Independent was it could encompass like all different kinds of disciplines. Like today we have a comedian on the site. Tomorrow we have 2 curators. Friday we have a writer. Like there's dancers, filmmakers, chefs. It can be anything, like a crafts person. We've had like woodworkers. And it was just a way to kind of have more of the interests that I was interested in, like represented on the site. And for me, what's been great is because we use freelancers, people often pitch things I've never heard of. And then I like research them, like, wow, this is cool. So then I end up learning stuff too. And I felt like with Pitchfork, it had reached a point where I was so used to the music that was coming my way. I didn't feel like I was learning all that much. I'm like, oh, cool. another Thou album. Oh, great, another like whatever album. But this, yeah, it's really felt like a learning process. But the whole idea was like I was kind of burnt out on the idea of like judging other people's work. And I thought, well, why don't we just like talk to people about the things they make, how they make them, focus on process instead of there being reviews or scores. It's really just like mostly in the voice of the person we're talking to. And like I've intentionally tried to edit my questions down so they're smaller. So it's because there's always that like interview thing, you know, a print interview where someone's like, you know, the interviewer ends up talking more than the person being interviewed. And I wanted to like on the site, like just sort of make it almost like my questions are kind of anonymous, just like, what do you do when you get creative blocks? Just like really basic things. So I'm not really pulling much of myself into it and letting them really sort of tell the story. And that was really the whole inspiration for it. I lucked out where my friends, Yancey and Perry, started Kickstarter. And Kickstarter is a public benefit corporation. So part of the public benefit corporation is they have a charter. And part of that PBC charter is to create resources for creative people, like free resources. And so when I was, you know, leaving Pitchfork, I started talking to them and like, yeah, it would be cool to work together on something. And the idea was like, what if, you know, you ran a site and it was a resource? Like, what would that site look like? And because I was like coming off the back of Pitchfork, where it was like 5 reviews a day at the time, news, so much stuff, I was like, what if it's just like one thing a day? And what if it's just, and we sort of started brainstorming it, and that's really how it came about. And that's how it can exist, is like through this PBC charter. And that's how it can live in the world, is this like free website with no advertising and all that stuff. So it was like a very lucky thing. And the thing was, I was in this coffee shop in Greenpoint where I live, and Yancey came in and he was like, how are things going at Pitchfork? And it's like one of those moments where I decided just to be honest and be like, well, I think I'm kind of burnt out and I want to move on. And that was like when we started the discussion. But it's again one of those things where if I was just like, it's fine, like, you know, we probably wouldn't be doing that part of the thing. So I think it's just that whole idea where it's really hard to plan. And so much of these things are just like happened by like that very funny moment that we just happen to be in the same coffee shop. He asks how I'm doing. I decide to be honest instead of just having like the cliched, things are okay response. And then it's like leads to the creative independent.
That's amazing. I mean, it's really, you know, again, the through line seems to be that there's a lot of different things creatively that you're, you know, involved with, but you're able to kind of navigate that in a way that seems really organic, right? It seems really, you know, you have, you know, I live on the west side of Los Angeles, so it's real easy for me. I could like throw a rock and hit a life coach and or to like talk about my higher purpose. But there seems to be, and I don't want to talk out of turn here, but it does seem to me like there's something very clearly intuitive about the way that you've navigated spaces, and with the hindsight of the experience that you've had, that you are now at a place where you're almost kind of paying it forward in the way that you're now creating these resources for people, whether it be the creative independent, whether it be as an artist manager, or whether it be as an author, where you're actually kind of helping facilitate that. I mean, do you see your role now as someone who is basically kind of helping people with that instruction manual, or that what a Pitchfork intern would have asked you when you were there?
Right. I think so. Yeah. I mean, I think that's definitely why the management stuff started. Like I started Zone 6 with my friend Caleb, who runs the label Sacred Bones. And it was one of those things where people would always ask us for advice or thoughts, and we would just kind of like give advice or thoughts. But at one point we were like, what if we just formalize this and actually become managers? And again, it just built very organically, and we just like, as it went on, more people came on board. But my impulse for that is very much just helping people out and like using the years of experience in that world, from like whether putting on shows or being a music writer, and Caleb's, you know, side being like someone who runs a successful independent label, how we can just sort of pass some of that information on to other people, which I think I always feel like for me, it's good to feel useful in some way. Like I don't want to, you know, it's funny. I was in the new book I'm writing is about failure, like the third book in the series. And part of it is like a whole story about this huge failure I had where I wanted to be a novelist when I was young. And like, I thought like that was the way to be a writer, was to be a novelist. And it was like such a big thing that, you know, even to this day, my dad would be like, do you think you'll ever write a novel? And I'm just like, no, I realized that that's not where my talent was. You know, like I tried, I kept a notebook, I filled out all this stuff, I worked on it, I read it back over and was like, this is terrible. Like, it's just not what I'm good at doing. But what it taught me was like what I was actually good at doing. And I think I want to use like some of those kinds of experiences just to help people who are, that are also trying to be creative. Because I think there's this like misunderstanding I think what people have, that they think it just gets easy for someone. Like if they start doing stuff, they're just like, boom, they're just done. They just glide through life. And I always tell this story that I interviewed Philip Glass for the Creative Independent when it first started, and he wanted to do the interview at his house. So I like went to his house in Manhattan, and he's like, I have a half an hour. And like, then I need to like get on with my practicing or whatever. And I was like, all right. So we did the interview for half an hour. I was like, all right, got to go practice now. And then like he showed me out and just went into his space and just immediately started, practicing music. And I was thinking, this guy's like 80 something years old. He's still putting in the work every day. He's not just like chilling and like not doing anything. And I feel like there is a part of like the Creative Independent, part of these books where it shows like, yeah, the creative process is a struggle for everyone. It's not easy. And like I get up at 5 to write, but it's not like I get up at 5 and I'm like, yeah, like, sometimes I get up at 5 and I'm like, oh man, like why am I getting up at 5? But once I start doing it, I'm like, cool, this is why I'm doing it. And it's like, I've tried, even if I just get like a couple things done, it's better than nothing,
And I have to say that I love, I'm going to read a quick excerpt from the book here.
Sure.
I've got it right here. And I think this really falls in line, because I have to say there has been that back and forth that I've had with people about like, well, do I have to choose my job over my art? I'm like, no, it's like saying you have to choose, not eating versus working on your work. So, but I wanted to just read this because I think this particular passage kind of nails it, what you were talking about. I've had a day job my whole life. While it hasn't always been easy, I've always managed to find the time to create. I've never been a full-time artist, though. Does this mean I'm not an artist? I don't think so. There are countless creative people who work part-time behind the scenes, people you've never seen mentioned in the front pages, who've contributed to films, books, art exhibitions, and theater pieces. Not everyone gets the glory or notoriety, but the work they do is still essential and creative. Like, to me, that nailed it. And for those of you, again, who haven't seen the book, there's also, don't read my personal stuff, but there's a workbook session here and I love that format too. And just the design. Look at how beautiful. Look at how
shout
beautiful.
out to Christian Hansen. Yeah, he did the design. It's amazing.
And these inner pages too. I mean, it's just such an amazing book here. But I think that kind of nails, what you were talking about in terms of like, you just kind of have to be able to put yourself out there and put in the work. And again, looking at kind of where you are in your career as a writer and a facilitator and an organizer, that must be a lot to juggle, but it sounds like you've got your routines down pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, and the thing is, like, routines don't always work. Sometimes shift, and sometimes things kind of explode. Like, there's certain days where I'll think, oh, cool. Like, for instance, yesterday I decided, you know what, I'm going to edit all of next week for the Creative Independent so that it's just like done and it's ready to go, and I can go into Thanksgiving and not think about it. So I got all that done. But the only reason I got it done is because it was a quiet day on the management side and a quiet day on some other sides. And like, I think a lot of people have already kind of taken off for the holiday. And honestly, like, the days before the holiday are some of my favorite days because people will go away and then I could just like plug out a few more things. But so I got that stuff done, but that sometimes like the best laid plans don't work. And I start the day, I'm like, I'm going to edit the whole site for next week. And then I get pulled into one meeting, then another, then my kid needs help, because now that we're in, COVID times and quarantine, the kids are taking, doing school from home because all the New York City public schools shut down. So they're home. And so, you sort of go from like, I'm going to do all this stuff to suddenly I'm upstairs helping a kid, one of my sons write one of his papers, or like helping him with debate team or figuring out math, which I'm terrible at. So there's like all these different things that get in the way in the day. So not every day works perfectly. So even though like I have like a schedule, I know it works. Some days it completely implodes. And it's just like at the end of the day, I'm like, what happened? Or I'll have like 5 Zooms in a row, all these meetings. And then I think a lot of that too is just things I think are busier for a lot of people right now in the music world because everyone's kind of reinventing how to exist in the music world because there's no touring. And so artists are thinking more about things like publishing, like finding good publishers so they can try to get like their songs featured in TV shows or like ads, or people are spending more time like maybe or setting up Patreons. There's like just all these different things happening. So yeah, I find it kind of goes in waves. And then usually the balance like works where I can kind of like move between things. But then once in a while, like everything happens at once. And then you're just like, And then by the end of the day, I'm like, man, I haven't done anything I was supposed to do, or I've done a million things and none of them is completely finished, you know, then I have to like go through and try to finish some.
I mean, you know, it sounds like with the creative and the creative independent, you can focus on the writing, and you can do the writing, you can plan it, and you know, and then you have sort of the day-to-day things. And I understand, because my son is also doing remote school. We got him in a pod, so it makes it somewhat easier. His mom and I are we co-parent, and so, you know, he goes to his pod, and we got the data to do our work, and which is great. But but still, it's a lot. And you know, at the end of the day, though, when I think about, okay, so there's a creative independent, there's the writing and the interviewing and all the things you have to do that can be done remotely. But then I look at Zone 6, and then I look at Basilica. Can you tell me a little bit about, you know, especially, and it's just a reality that we're all kind of dealing with, how are you working with the artists that are currently under your management at Zone 6? How are you helping them to kind of, you know, like mind the gap during this weird time for people that are in creative spaces? Right.
It's interesting. Like it's, you know, a lot of the artists I manage are actually having like they're doing really well right now. And I think part of it is like, they've had a lot of time to work on music. They kind of realized touring wasn't always the best thing for the artist anyway. You missed a live experience, you miss seeing your fans, but it's not the most lucrative thing unless you're, you know, a huge band. If you're like a mid-sized indie rock band, you're paying like a tour manager, you're paying the band members in many cases. If you're like a solo artist with a band, you know, the booking agent gets a cut. Like by the end, you're just like, it's not the biggest moneymakers. I think a lot of artists have been focusing on like publishing, like I was saying, like getting like syncs and like, you know, having their songs show up in different things. And then they've also just been working on more music, which has allowed them to like, you know, either to fulfill an album for their label or to like look for a new label. So I think a lot of people are kind of in that space where they're moving around a lot or focusing on their merch stores. A lot of people are like really building up their merch stuff. And it's sort of funny. My friend Mike Renaud, who was the creative director at Pitchfork, and he was like the Pitchfork VP. He and Chris, who was the Pitchfork president, they left and they started their own design company in Chicago. And they're the ones that are helping me with the design for my artists. Like we all just keep coming back together again, you know, and Mike has been like working on like t-shirts for people and like font designs for like, you know, other people and just kind of getting all that stuff together. So yeah, people have been able to focus on like merch and that kind of stuff. And most people I manage are not based in New York. So, you know, I manage someone in Australia, New Zealand, where they're actually both able to play shows because COVID's a different thing there. And an artist in Ireland. And one of my artists who actually is from LA, Sarah Beth Tomberlin, but has been living in New York. I actually am able to see her, but what we'll do is we'll just like meet outside wearing masks, sit our 6 feet apart and just have like a quick catch up, you know, like, all right, here are things that we want to get done this week. Here's some stuff. Or, you know, I Zoom with a lot of people. A lot of it is like the Zooming thing. But yeah, I think people are actually doing okay because a lot of them release records. And the thing is, people are buying music right now and listening to music, like streams are up. Most labels I talk to are like, oh yeah, this is the best year we've ever had. And it's because people are just like home. And I think also people aren't spending money to go to shows. So they're putting that money, if they're, oh, I want to support this artist, I'll buy their record. Or if I want to support this artist, I'll buy a t-shirt. So I think that's really happening where like I've spoken to multiple labels in the past couple of weeks just for like a variety of reasons. And one of them was like, yeah, we're up 300% from last year. Someone's like people are like seeing significant, spikes in business because of that. I think because people are spending less money. I even find like Jane and I, my wife, in our own situation, like we haven't paid for a babysitter in like a year. You know, we haven't paid for like childcare. Like there's things that we're suddenly just not spending money on. We've been cooking a lot more, like less ordering out. So just like things that I think people's lives have gotten like more contained, and they're just like not out as much. So they have more, I don't want to say disposable income, but just more money to like spend on things like records and all that. So yeah, artists are doing okay. I think the trick is when touring goes back up again, what have they learned from this downtime? You know, I think a lot of artists I work with are essentially like, you know what, we don't want to go on these like 70 date tours anymore. We want to be a little more careful. We want to like choose things that feel a little bit more like worth the time. We want to make sure the setup is correct. We want to make sure that we're on a bill that makes sense. And so I think people are going to be a little more thoughtful about those sorts of things. Like it's something Caleb and I always talk about is like the music industry. It's not like the music industry was like buzzing along perfectly before this. So it's not like the the music industry was just like perfect example of harmony, and then COVID happened and it fell apart. It's like, it's been a mess, for a long time. And so this, I think, just kind of pointed out some of those. It really put a spotlight on some of these things that were really ridiculous and really streaming and how people aren't getting paid enough for Spotify, all these things. And it just kind of put a highlight on that stuff. But it's all been there. And I think people are actually finding creative ways to kind of work their way around it, or to not have to depend so much on that, to find money in other ways and to sort of create a living in other ways. One of the artists I manage, MoMA, she's one of the most prolific people in the world and just makes so much music, but she's also been doing lots. She has a talk with Artist Space tonight, and she's, doing something with a different arts organization next week. And she's sort of doing these panels and online Zooms. And the fact is, it's so much easier for her to sit there in her house, go on a Zoom, talk about her work, than have to go travel somewhere. And it's just faster. She can go back to doing her music, and she'll get paid, she gets paid to do the thing. And it's just if you can find that kind of stuff, it's actually kind of better off, There's a panel at Unsound Festival in Poland that I was on via Zoom 2 months ago. And I was thinking, this is great. I got to talk. It was really fun, but I was in my house. I didn't have to fly to Poland. And it's not I would love to fly to Poland, but it's as and you have a child and you're, both parents are involved. And then you're all right, bye, I'm gonna go to Poland for a few days for this thing. And panels don't pay a huge amount of money. So it's not super lucrative to go to Poland for a panel. But if I can turn on my computer, talk to people, and have that same experience, I think that kind of stuff actually is almost better in this digital format. Live shows, no, live shows are so much better in person, but Zooms and panels, it's oh wow, this is kind of cool. You can do these things without having to go all the way there, So I think people are learning to adapt and finding the things that are useful to them. But yeah, at first, I think nobody knew what to do, back in March and April, and everything kind of just stalled, went to a stop. But I think once people realized this was not going to be over, anytime soon, I think at first we were all oh yeah, by June we'll be back to normal and all that kind of stuff. Then people had to kind of actually figure out how to work around it. So I think early on it was different. It was nobody was doing anything. It just kind of was and then there was a moment all right, we need to kind of adapt. We can't just wait this thing out. So then people started coming up with different ideas.
What do you think, if you look at sort of the new, whatever the new normal is with streaming and more experiential things and more purchasing of records, I have to say though, I'm really it's a great thing to hear that labels and artists, because my biggest fear in this thing is that people that were already kind of working on the margins to begin with would just be completely devastated with no source of income, and things would would alter. So it's really great to hear that there are a group of artists and labels that are doing so well. Looking at all this, and let's make an assumption that, say, come January, there's some type of vaccine, the distribution happens, and we start to get back to normal, shows start to happen again. What do you think? And you did mention that maybe being a little bit more thoughtful about the types of shows and maybe not relentless touring. Is there anything else besides those things that you think we're going to travel into the future that the pandemic has fundamentally changed about how music and labels and artists go about doing their work?
Yeah, I think most of it is the live stuff, I would say. I do see that changing a lot. And I've already heard a lot of festivals that would normally be in the summer are pushing to the fall just to see, to give themselves enough time. I was well, maybe that changes, festival season shifts. Maybe that's a different thing. We always do Basilica in September. And I was talking to a booking agent the other day, and he mentioned Pitchfork was going to maybe move around that time. And I was all right, we got to move our date because it would start conflicting with our thing. So I see that happening. I think some people maybe start putting out, instead of records, putting out more singles, kind of keeping. I think that's one thing people have realized during this is you hate to say content, but people keep putting out content in order to stay visible because you can't tour anymore. I think as people are realizing you can sort of do that and kind of keep things out there, you don't need to be as precious about each thing you do. You're just all right, I'm going to get this thing done and put that up. And certain people will know what is the bigger, if you're putting out a proper record versus a cover that you made on your iPhone, people will know the iPhone cover is not supposed to be the masterpiece. Like, oh, cool, this is something fun they put up there. I think it's lowered the stakes in some ways. And like some artists I manage, like Tomberlin's a good example. She'll just hop on to Instagram Live all the time and like do a show. And, you know, then people come in and watch her and she takes requests. And I think like people are just sort of learning to like engage an audience in a different way. And I can imagine a lot of that will sort of continue. But the biggest thing really is, I think like something More Mother, you know, her name is Kamei, has always done is just she's put out a lot of stuff. And I think her model that she's always just done naturally has really worked well for her during COVID because she can't tour, but she can keep putting out the music she's doing and sort of constantly having new releases and all like, you know, putting them up on Bandcamp, not treating it like it has to be like just a special once a year thing. And people are buying it. So I think that's something people have learned is just to kind of, and it's sort of the dude that runs Spotify, Daniel Ek, he made some comments about that. Everybody was mad, like sort of about feeding the machine and all that. And I was like, you know what?
Oh, I remember that vividly. There are people like there were a couple of memes that had him on there that said some really nasty.
Yeah.
You'll have to excuse me. I think they just started to power wash my building. Of course they did because
that's perfect. Anyway,
but I saw that statement. And it was like, yeah.
Yeah, but I think like as much as he's I don't want to say he's terrible. I don't know him personally, but as much as like his business model is not great, there is some truth to that. Where like the way that things have shifted is people do just they just want a lot of stuff. You know, like you don't have to, and maybe you're an artist who doesn't do that. Like you don't need to be the writer that spends 30 years on a book. You can be someone who's like, no, I put out 5 books a year. I'm like Tom Clancy. Like you can be like a different kind of artist, different kind of writer. But I think like the difference when I was growing up, you know, I'd get like the new Dinosaur Jr. album and that's all I would listen to for a month. I'm like, this is my one record I can get, the only one I can afford. I'm going to play this thing forever. And I think music is so much more accessible now. People can get it at a cheaper price. They can buy 2 songs versus a whole record. So he's right. People are actually consuming things in a different way. They're not like, you know, most people aren't buying one thing a month and then just like, all right, cool, that's my thing. They're like sampling things. They're trying out stuff. They're on TikTok. They're just like doing the way people interact with the world is so much faster. And I think the music industry, like the touring thing was almost like this incongruous thing where someone's life was almost put on hold for like 8 months because they'd go on tour. They're not at home. They're just traveling like town to town, not making a huge amount of money. Then they're suddenly back where they were. Like, all right, now I need to like make more music to keep this machine going. And I think one thing that people realize without the touring is you can kind of just keep making the music and doing other things. And so yeah, I really do think it's going to change touring forever. And I think there are bands who just love to tour, you know, like, you know, there was like, you know, Power Trip, who, you know, Riley passed this year, but it's like before that, it's like they would just tour constantly. And like, there's bands like that, or like Trash Talk will always do like 1 million shows. Like they can have their fashion imprints and clothing lines, but they're still like, we're going to tour. And I think, or like back in the day, like Black Flag or whatever, there's just certain bands that's part of their ethos. But I think for certain artists, this is a time to realize, you know what, maybe that touring model doesn't work for me. Maybe I play like 2 festivals and like try to get a show at like a museum, or like try to do this or that, like try to play some other kinds of stuff and not do the like, you know, 1 million shows a year kind of thing. I really think that will change a lot. I also think it's going to take a while for people to go back to shows. I mean, once there's a vaccine, people will, but I don't know. Like I talked to some booking agents, my friend Giorgio, who books some bands of mine, who's based in Italy. And once he tells me like all of the precautions people would have to go to get into a show, I'm just like, yeah, I don't really want to stand in a show 6 feet away from people with a mask on, getting my temperature taken. It's just like so intense. I'm like, I'd rather just wait until there's a vaccine and we can just kind of go back to this and like do it in a, you know.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's the places where they are doing shows. I've seen a lot of that where it's just so over the top. It's just it's so much to be able, especially when it's like, as a rule of thumb for me, it's always like, well, when I go out, I'm usually just like having a good time and I want to enjoy myself and I want to see the show, and all those different layers make it more complicated. You know, with the live music piece, you know, you take sort of the other piece of the equation with Basilica. You know, what are your plans for Basilica, and how are you guys kind of navigating this space between now and the point where you can actually book a show?
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah, Melissa, who I founded that with, Melissa Oftermore, she and I have been like we're talking about it, like figuring like this year we decided to do nothing. We were like, you know what, let's not do anything, because that festival is so much about being in that space. And like, you know, I think my kids are yelling back, but it only fits like 1,400 people. And it's like very much about being there. And we're like, you know, if we try to do some streamed version, it's not going to be it's not going to be the same thing. So let's not even bother to try. And I think sometimes that's the best route is like, all right, we'll skip this year. We'll go back next year. But we've been talking about how to do it next year. We always do it in September. So there is the possibility it could work because people have been saying they can imagine touring starting again, like the fall, the end of 2021, because we're about to go into 2021. Yeah. So like the fall of 2021, people can imagine touring happening again. So it might be possible. We've been talking about different ways to curate it. Like maybe we keep bands more local. Maybe we have fewer bands. Like I don't know, there's ways we're trying to figure it out, but if it ends up being where it would have to be digital again, we would just like skip another year. I mean, the thing is like, because Melissa and I have other things we do and that space can be used for other things. Like basically they've been renting it out for like video shoots or like things that can be safe and be small and they can still bring in some revenue. And they also, this is like really been a useful thing where my friends own that metal bar in New York, St. Vitus, and they did like a Kickstarter to try to keep it from closing down. And it went really well. They were trying to raise like $30,000 and made like 150,000 or something. It was like some huge success. And that kind of opened up a door for a lot of other venues. And so Basilica did one too. Melissa did one. And so she managed to like make enough to kind of keep the place open until next year, until like, because they're basically missing they missed their entire programming this year. So it kind of makes up for that lost year by and large. And then we can try to start again next year. So I think like patching things together and just keeping things alive, it's like my management partner, Caleb, opened a venue in Ridgewood, Queens, like 3 weeks before COVID hit New York. And so it's just like disastrous, but also
that's a tough time. That's a tough time to open a venue.
It's and they were working on it for a long time. It was like just in retrospect, it's like, oh my God. But what's been their saving grace is they have an outdoor space, they have heaters, they have retractable like overhead, and people just want to get outside. And so if they can sit out there and be distanced and safe, it's certainly not like they're not bringing in, they're not doing like, but they're breaking even. They're able to stay alive. And I think that's what people are doing right now is I think people have shifted expectations a bit in many sectors where it's like, okay, as long as we can keep this going, and then when things are better and we can do shows again, we'll be there to do those shows. And that's what we thought with Basilica this year. Like instead of spending a lot of money to try to do live streams and this and that, because you have to pay for the production, get the bands to go, like, let's just like cut our losses. We don't make anything, but we're also not losing anything from trying to do something, and like find a way to sort of fundraise in the meantime. And then like we can come back again later. So I think that's where we are with that. It's not the kind of show that lends itself to being like a streamed. I don't think most shows are, honestly, but I get why people are doing them. It's like a way to kind of keep things moving. And if you have a big album cycle like Perfume Genius or something, it makes sense why you would do live streams. You want to kind of, especially someone who's like kind of in that moment of building to the next level as an artist, it's a way for them to do that. Like Phoebe Bridgers too, like doing those big live streams she was doing. And then I just saw today, she was like nominated for 4 Grammys or something. So I think a lot of these people knew they were like in this moment where they're kind of going to that next space. And so they had to kind of keep doing it. It's different for each artist,
Well, I mean, it is, you have to rethink everything on multiple levels. And, which I guess, in a way, looking at Zone 6, and it sounds like from the artist management side that they're really, really new and innovative ways to kind of direct those artists in a way. Basilica, it sounds like that's going to survive and you can retool when things have changed. Mm-hmm. But this time absolutely does lend itself well to writing. So if you could, tell me a little bit about how, make time for creativity. And then this, which is again, one in a series of 3 books that will ultimately be published. Mm-hmm. Tell me a little bit about how that came about. Sure. And tell me your motivation behind, getting that started and getting that going.
It's interesting. It's one of those things where it didn't end up where it started at all. And it was like, initially I was trying to do like kind of a book that was sort of like how to do things, like how to book a show, how to make a zine, like more like the guides that we do on TCI on some level, like the Creative Independent. But then as I was doing that, I was like, we kind of do that really well on the site. I don't really need, does not need to be something else kind of about that world, And so then I started just writing some personal essays, and this editor, whose name is Catherine Tung at Viking, who worked there at the time, was like, these essays are like really interesting. You should like keep working on that stuff. So I was like, all right. So I just kind of kept writing these personal essays. And then we got kind of like shifted what my pitch was. I was like, well, then it became more memoir, but still with this like how-to stuff kind of like laid onto it. So it was kind of like, I grew up in this town. I put on shows. Here's how you do a show. And so it kind of just kept like adapting. And then basically we went into Abrams, me and my agent, whose name is Chad, and we showed them like the proposal. And then this woman at the press named Carrie was like, you know, I've been looking at this and like, what if you like approached it in this way? And like, you have all this stuff here, but what if you pulled it out and like kind of like made it more of like less of a how-to, but allowing people to kind of like interact with your prompts or whatever. Cause I have all these prompts in there, but I hadn't really like spelled it out as like a separate workbook kind of thing. So then we kind of started talking about that and just kind of kept morphing and morphing and morphing. And then it finally became this thing where it's kind of like the zines I used to make, kind of like a memoir. It's a how-to. It's also like a scrapbook, and it's like a collection of other like people I've worked with and friends, and like an oral history of all these other people and their process. And it's like a space for people to journal their own thoughts. And so I think, again, it's one of these things where just what it ended up becoming is so different than what it started as. And in the third book, I actually talk about that, where I say like, you could see it as a failure to go in and be like, here's my idea. And then they're like, well, what if you shift it a little bit? And some people, you're like, oh no, that's just, it's my way or the highway kind of thing. But I've always sort of liked to kind of find things out that way and to kind of allow room for collaboration. And like, there's a reason why, you were doing my introduction before, it's like co-founder of this or that, because I always like working with other people, like doing stuff together. So it's not like I'm founding something on my own. Like there's a friend and you're working together for a reason, you're drawn to that person. That's really how it came about. And then I just thought, I want to just include people that I've done projects with. So that's why like, in the second book, Melissa, who I do Basilica with, is in there a lot. And like Matthew's in the second book a lot. My friend Matt, who's in the band The National, who like we've done a lot of things together, like all those kinds of things. It's just like friends and also people in different fields. And it became like a very comfortable way for me to approach people, because I wanted it to feel like the people were in there for a reason, because, we've done stuff together. Like I'm not just randomly like hitting up someone because they have like a name or, whatever. It's like, oh no, these are people that we all have connections for some reason. And then that way it feels like more like, it feels more natural and just like more personal. And then also because the people who read it are writing their own thoughts in there, then they become part of the collaboration too. So I just liked that model, like how it developed. But it was like kind of just slowly came together that way. And the first book is about making time. The second book is how to like keep making time, essentially, like how to stay inspired. Then the third one is, like I was saying before, like how to fail successfully, because as I was writing like the first chapter this morning, and it's like, yeah, everybody fails. So I was like, I don't fear failure because I fail all the time at stuff. And it's like, you just kind of get used to it. And you kind of like, there's this painter, Noelia Towers, who's in the book. And she basically says like, yeah, if I'm not failing, I'm scared, because I feel like every time you fail, you learn something. So if you stop failing, you stop learning stuff. And so it's just like, you basically make the time, you stay inspired, then like you have a hiccup in the road, and then you just kind of have to keep going. So that's like the idea of the three books together, is the process. Like that's the whole TCI logo of like the spiral. The idea is that like the creative process keeps circling back over and over again, and like it never ends. And you kind of keep coming back to the same concerns. Like Jane, my wife, will often make fun of me. She's like, man, you always collaborate with the same people. I'm like, yeah, it's because it's like my friend group and my community. And like, I like doing the stuff we do together. And we can often be obsessed with the same things over and over again, but you can keep coming at it from different angles. And then every once in a while, you kind of like jaunt out into something else, learn something new, and then come back. But yeah, the books have been really fun. I feel like I've like things I'd forgotten about, like mentors I'd forgotten about, I remembered and wrote about again. Like in the second book, I read about Michael Griffin, who was like a mentor to me as a kid, who is a noise musician in the band Noggin and in Behead the Prophet. And he was like in his late 50s when I was like 20. And I was like, wow, here's someone who can like live a life, who's working class, like I grew up, but is able to like still do creative things. And in a world that like, he's not going to get rich making noise music or being in a punk band called Behead the Prophet, but he's happy. He's found a way to kind of balance a day job, do his work at night. He also paints. I mean, this is kind of the perfect life, So as a kid, all these things that kind of implanted themselves in me, and like sort of like, oh wow, there is a way that I could do this kind of stuff. That's what's for me been like the most satisfying part of the book, is kind of these books is like able to kind of remember those people. And one that I was just writing this weekend is my friend Kenny, who like died in his 40s of cancer. But he was the one who basically said to me, like, you should just like quit your job and try to make a living as a writer. And I was like, dude, man, I've always had a job. There's no way I can do that. And he's like, well, what if you just take jobs that have to do with writing? So then I started doing freelance. And that's how like I kind of made that step into like living off my writing and stuff. But he basically, yeah, like he was a filmmaker, but like making weird experimental stuff in Canada. And he's like, we don't have a lot of time. You should just like do stuff while you can. And then, yeah, the fact that he ended up dying when he was 45 was just like, holy shit, this really was like, we don't have a huge amount of time. So why not make the most of it? You know? And so I think going back in the books and kind of getting to memorialize those people too, because a lot of these mentors have passed, it just feels like, cool, they gave me this advice. Now maybe this advice can help someone else too. So like you were saying before, it feels like passing it on, you know, like sort of passing it forward and help. Yeah. Because everyone needs help, you know, and I definitely, and I think it's funny, the books have been, they're filed under self-help, which is cool by me, but it's like,
there was one thing that I was talking to a friend of mine about this when I first found the book, and I was like, oh man, this thing is great because, you know, this guy, and he's written all this stuff that I've read in the past, and he's someone I respect, but in his workbook, and I walked him through it, and he was really quiet. He's like, so is it kind of like the artist way for hipsters? Like,
yeah.
I hate to phrase it that way, but as someone who owns and has done the artist way, I just want to say that I have a high amount of respect for that. But I also feel like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. Like they're power washing my air conditioner right now.
That's good.
So let me get this in. So as someone who is kind of approaching this from that perspective of someone who is helping someone, like, you know, there is an element of like, a lot of that stuff just doesn't speak to me. It's kind of like meditation for me. And I told someone this once, I'm like, I couldn't really get down with a lot of the frou-frou shit when I'm a big fan of mindfulness, but the first person that broke through to me was Noah Levine, who is like basically tatted knuckles to neck. The first time I sat with him in meditation, he sat down quietly, and the first thing he says to this group that's quiet, he's like, you guys fucking ready? I'm like, this is someone that I align my ethos aligns with, right? And someone I feel like I can connect with. That's what this book was to me. It's an important book to me. And like I said, I'm only halfway through it, but it's really forcing me to kind of dig in to myself about it. I mean, is that something that happened? I mean, that you think about how what kind of impact this is going to have on other people?
Yeah, I've had like different people have reached out. You know, my kids had this great babysitter named Max, who's also like, he's an electronic musician, and he's living outside of New York now, but he wrote and was like, yeah, I've really been using this, like using these exercises as I work on my next record. Or like even people I manage who bought it, who are like, wow, this is really useful. I've been like filling this thing out. So, and I've gotten letters from, you know, emails from people that I don't know, which is great. But it's funny you say the artist's way, because we made these TCI t-shirts. This guy, Carlos, made them. And I wanted them to look like metal shirts, even though they're TCI shirts, which is like sort of funny and ridiculous. So it has like the spiral logo on the front, and on the back, it has this statement from Laurel Schwartz, who is like the one who designed the website early on with me. She was like initial like a creative director. And then the sleeve actually has like, you know, like in a metal shirt, how there's like all the script on the side, but it's a quote from The Artist's Way. And we did that on purpose to kind of like, and then the other one is like spirals or something. So it's kind of like, it looks like this like tough shirt, but it's just like creative process, like that's awesome. Artist's Way, TCI thing. And we always joke, like, hey, we should send the woman who wrote The Artist's Way like one of those shirts and hope she doesn't sue us. But I mean, we always just like give them away for free. We've never made anything off them. And we don't have that many of them, but it's like, yeah, I think that was when we were making, like I've explained to, you know, one of the first talks we did at TCI was me and Ian Mackay, like from Discord Records and stuff. And
I heard him. He's in a little bit.
yeah. And he came up, and like, he was another mentor of me when I was a kid, who I looked up to so much. And he like took the train from DC just to do this talk with me to introduce the website, then went back. And to me, that was like a huge deal, because when I was a kid, like I really loved the way he ran the label, like his ethics, like all that kind of stuff. But early on, when he and I did a conversation about TCI, like when it first started, I was essentially like, yeah, my ethos was like punk zines. Like that's like the simplicity of punk zines, but then also throwing in like these kinds of things. Like I've never, you know, I've read parts of The Artist's Way. Like I've never done the actual thing, but I worked in a bookstore when it came out, so I know a lot about it. You know, I worked at a Borders, and it was just like everywhere. But I was like, it's kind of like self-help mixed with like punk zines. Like that's kind of what it is, you know? And he was like, yeah, you get that feel from it. And I think essentially it is. And I think, but it's like you're saying, self-help for someone who might be like turned off by like the trappings around yoga, or like sort of like the capitalism of that kind of stuff, where it's like, you need these special pants, you need to do this, you got like, this is just like, no, you can just, you use what's around you. You can like buy one little cheap book if you want. You can also borrow it from a friend. Like part of it too is like the size of the books. I was like, cool, maybe these can like almost fit in someone's pocket. Like they're like sort of like enough that you can pass around, kind of like semio textbooks used to be or something, or zines used to be. And that's something Chad and I, it's funny because my agent Chad is actually like a death metal drummer, and he got into like book stuff. And so he knows both worlds too, and he just had a kid, like he and his wife had a daughter. And so he's like juggling all this stuff too. But it's like, I just love that, like there's all these worlds where you can find, like when I was a kid, if someone was like an agent, I would picture someone in a suit, like, this and that. I'm like, no, it's like Chad, who's like tattooed and is a death metal guy. And then it's like, you find like the people of your community kind of branching out in different places, and you kind of work together. And I think I'm like lucky to have found him. And he also is like Kim Kelly. Do you know Kim Kelly, who does like a lot of like writes about labor stuff, and like she's a metal writer. Yeah. He's her agent too. But yeah, so, and she grew up in the same town as me, which is the other thing. But she's much younger than me. So by the time she came of age, I was long gone. So we never knew each other in the town, because she's like, 15 years younger than me or something. So we only found out we lived in the same town at a metal show once. She was like, "Where'd you grow up?" And I said, "New Jersey." And she said, "Where?" I said, "Chatsworth." And she was like, "What?" Because like Chatsworth is so small. But yeah, like that you find your people out in the world is like the end of the day. I think what this book is, what I wanted this book to be too, is like the people who find it and get it will be the people who find it and get it. Like the people that are like, "Oh, cool, this resonates." And that was my hope, is like the people that I would be friends with, the people that I'd collaborate with, like they would be the ones who would see something for themselves in it. Like even like, when I said Ian MacKaye, and then you're like, "Oh yeah, of course, you know who it is." Yeah. But it's like, it's like those people, the people who know who Ian MacKaye is, like that's like it's sort of like, that kind of world.
It is a very specific, it's very specific, like a certain mindset, and I think it's amazing. Well, listen, I am, like I said, it's one of the best things that I've picked up in a long time.
Thank you very much.
It's been hugely helpful to me. Brandon Stosuy, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me.
I really appreciate it. Stay safe during the pandemic. And I just want to take this opportunity right now to say, Jeffrey Tice, a good friend of our shows, passed away last Thursday. And we just want to send our condolences to his friends and family, and to his husband, John. And he's going to be greatly missed. He was a big part of the electronic music community and the house music community in San Francisco. And I just want to say, Jeffrey, we hope you are in a good place right now. And we miss you. And you were one of the good ones, man. Thank you. Brandon Stosuy, thank you so much. The book again is Make Time for Creativity. It's part of the what will most likely be the Holy Trinity, the Lord of the Rings of our time, creative people. Brandon, thank you so much, and much luck with everything that you're doing moving forward, man. Take care.
Thanks for having me. Okay? Good luck with the show. Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, man. Take care. Bye-bye.